Welcome, everyone, to our December 2025 ICODR member meeting. First of all, I want to say how much fun Cyber Week was last month. And Leah, thank you so much for all the hard work you did, herding all the cats. I urge everybody to go and take a look at the agenda. A lot of the recordings have been embedded into the agenda. So I've been going back even just last week. I was watching a few more sessions that I had missed during the live sessions, but it was best Cyber Week ever. So Leah, thanks to you, thanks to Noam, and Dan, everybody for all the hard work. I thought it
And
was
you
great.
too, Colin.
Well, the beauty of it's like a potluck. We all bring our sessions and then, we sort of see, oh, look at this incredible spread. So it was really a lot of fun. And let me admit Mac, who just joined. Um, I'm actually going to ask Mac to talk before we start with the book. Hi, Mac. Thanks for joining. Good to have you here. Mac is actually working on a documentary. And Mac, I know I'm surprising you because you just joined 2 seconds ago. Would you mind just saying a minute about this before we start with the meat of the meeting?
Yes, thank you so much for the opportunity. Yes, hi everyone, Mac PLE here. I've been doing the Alamine podcast for years and I've had, Colin on and Daniel and other people. And so this past, what, March, April, we were all in London together. And in London, just kind of came with the idea, hey, it would be kind of cool to tell the story of ODR from its inception in the early 2000s until now, because I don't think anybody's ever really put something together that actually showed the world what, online mediation truly is, or online arbitration, ODR. Anyway, it's kind of become amateur filmmaking on my part. And so I've gotten a chance to travel all over the place to interview different people who've, been big names in this whole industry. And the goal is to educate the public. The working title so far is Can ODR Change the World? The Evolution and Promise, the Story and Promise of Online Dispute Resolution, because I think that it presents a good opportunity. And my big thing is always democratizing the access to justice and letting people know that there's alternatives to just going to court. And I think sometimes talking to each other is one thing, but talking to the masses and the millions of people out there is another. And the best way to do that is to storytell. And this documentary is my method of trying to get out there. So yeah,
Well,
thank
Mac,
you.
thank you so much for sharing that. And I think you're underselling yourself. Mac and I had a chance to get together when I was down in Texas teaching at Texas A&M, and he brought in lights and all these B-roll and lapel mics and all this stuff. I was like, wow, I feel like I'm in a Hollywood. This feels like CNN. So I think you're doing an amazing job, Mac. And I think it's exciting for people to know about this project. So keep us
Appreciate it.
posted because we're going to want to have a big premiere. Maybe
Oh,
we'll do it at the Chinese Theater in LA, right? And we can have all the stars come out.
wow.
But no, I really appreciate all the hard work. So
Great.
keep us posted and thank you for leading on that.
Absolutely.
Another thing
Colin,
oh,
you
please,
got
Dan.
you got the full Hollywood treatment. We Mac and I sat in my back garden and fought the wildlife that was making noise out
Well,
there.
the natural lighting is probably better than the cavernous, law school office. So Mac had to bring his own illumination. But yeah, so I can't wait to hear more about that as it evolves. And Leah and Ethan and I have been talking a lot about ODR 2026. We have the website up, which is at odr2026.org. And I think it's really coming together. I think we're going to be doing a joint event with the Future DR conference that's been held the past few years. So Future DR is going to be held at Suffolk Law School on the 12th of June. And then we're going to do the ODR forum at Harvard on the 11th of June. And we're going to have a hackathon on June 13th, which is a Saturday. We're going to do that at Suffolk. And I think we have an exciting day of activities for those of you who haven't been to Boston before. I think we're going to get a tour of the MIT Media Lab. We're going to get a tour of the State House. So it's going to be a lot of fun. So please pencil it in to your, oh, wow, we have John Zalesnikov on the call with us. That's exciting. I don't know what time it is in Australia. I think it's super early. So more details coming soon. I told Leah that I was going to send an email out to all the fellows and everybody, with the placeholder. We're still trying to figure out accommodations because unfortunately we're there at the same time as FIFA. So hotel rooms are tight. So I'm looking for a school that might be able to let us stay in the dorms and we can stay as a block. So more details are going to be coming out soon, but it'll be June 11th, 12th, 13th 2026. And I think it's going to be a lot of fun. So stay posted for more information. But we don't want to take too much time away from our wonderful guests here. Obviously, ICODR pioneers and leaders. I think we have two presidents of ICODR on this panel, so you don't need any hosting from me. Chris, obviously, that means it's just a matter of time for you, so get ready. But I think this book is a huge event in the ODR field. And I think all of us know that AI is positioned to not only catapult ODR into the future, but also potentially wash over a lot of the work that we've done in the past, because AI opens up so many exciting possibilities. But governing AI is one of the key questions that all of us need to wrap our heads around. And this book is an incredible contribution in that respect. So Dan, Leah, Chris, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us here today. Okay, so let me just start and sort of start at the beginning of the beginning. How did you guys decide to write this book? Was there one person who was kind of the mover and shaker? And I think Scott is not with us, but he is also a fourth author on the book. So tell us the story of what motivated that.
Well, I think it's my fault, at least to some degree. I guess I still am the series editor for Brill of an ODR series.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the reasons that I was interested in this is obviously you can't not talk about artificial intelligence now. It's everywhere. It touches just about everything. And I thought that there were a couple of people who might be able to put a reasonable spin on the notion of governing artificial intelligence. So I first contacted Chris and Scott because Chris has a background in regulation and law, especially with things that are unsafe and sort of talking about what safety should mean. And Scott has a long history of international standards work. And then we added Leah because it's when we looked at each other, we said we're missing something, and what we're missing is Leah's voice from the point of view of professional standards and standards that really address directly the use of AI that might be most common among people who are involved in the dispute resolution world. Although the book doesn't really narrow itself to the dispute resolution world. But it's the impulse from my part was that you hear two things about artificial intelligence over and over again. Either it's going to kill us all, or it's going to create this wonderful new world. And it's obviously both of those are false. We don't know what it's going to do in the short term, particularly. But the question of whether you can govern it is a really interesting one. The answer to that is a hard no, because it's developed in the open so much that anybody who wants to do bad things has access to AI tools and can do bad things. You're never going to stop them. But the other end of that question was very interesting. And that is, if there is a possibility of governing or controlling AI, what does that look like? And we started out with the notion of three different domains: law and regulation, which to my mind, and Chris may disagree with this, but to my mind, that's a very high level. There are things that are obvious that we should regulate for that don't really change very much over time. And I keep using the example of, I own my own personal body. I own my own personal information, or at least I should. And that's not something that's going to change over time. And that's something regulation could address. But there are so many things that regulation can address because they change quite rapidly. And so you have an international standards domain, which addresses some of that, which crosses borders, which is wide-ranging, but which may be just as political as putting together regulation and may take just as long. And then at the lowest level, you have professional standards that are there to guide people who are choosing what applications to use. And those are the ones that I find the most interesting, really, when you get down to it. And I'll say one more thing, and then I'll shut up and let my colleagues go. And that is that, to me, the marketplace is important. We are going to see more and more and more applications developed specifically for very targeted use in dispute resolution and elsewhere. And the way that you can potentially, at least partially, govern the development and use of AI is to give good grounding, good standards, and good guidance to developers of those systems and to the people who are going to be looking at those systems and saying, I will or will not use it. And so I think the marketplace will drive to some extent. And so anyway, that's, in my mind, that's what was in my head. And I wanted to gather some people together who could talk about that intelligently and say, okay, we're not totally going to hell in a handbasket. There is some hope. what does that look like? So
Hmm.
that's the rationale behind it.
That's great. Chris, why don't I go to you next? I mean, you've been a deep thinker on this stuff for a long time. How did your vision fit in with the vision that Dan just articulated?
No, I think really, really well, and I think that often we like to, pose ourselves as foils of each other when I don't think we really are. Because I think that as we mentioned the other day, I think that standards and regulations are always going to go hand in hand. I think the big piece of what we did within this work was try to identify, number one, what is the tool truly from functional practical use, especially in use cases like ours, which are not pattern based, right? ODR, ADR, the process of human resolution is a very natural process, and AI is built to mimic pattern. When you're looking at something and its appropriateness for use, it's important to start to say, okay, what are number one the standards are relevant to us, which I thought is where I think Leah's piece very elegantly pulls together a lot of work that a lot of us have done over a number of years into demonstrating why none of the regulation objective we want to get to can exist without the standards first. And also within here, we must understand what is the nature of the tool, what is the nature of its designers, and most importantly, where are we going to be able to affect change when we accept the fact that AI is not a traditional product. This isn't like when we started rolling out Zoom, and the biggest thing we needed to worry about was who has access to the file afterwards. Is the recording on? You know, Otter AI's biggest problem is whether or not it's breaking confidentiality and whether or not it jumps in there and records stuff and shares it without notice. AI is a fundamentally different informational sovereignty problem. Where Otter AI's problem was whether or not the data was protected, the data was meeting its confidentiality requirements, or ours more appropriately. We have a new human problem where we have an individual similar to a very eager intern who has access to repeatedly and continually misinterpret a whole heap of important data and send it out faster than any of us are able to go and catch it. The problems that we identify within, chapters 1 through 3 are ones of this is a human problem. They are human dangers. It's the speed at which these tools are able to generate realistic looking, in many cases, conspiracy level stories. How we as a group apply the safety mechanism, which is right now human, and understanding those uses of human safety catches, be it in the loop, on loop, out loop, and what they mean for us. And most importantly, when we think about regulation and think about where we want to go with regulation, I think exactly to Dan's point is that we need to be looking at it from the perspective of what is a stakeholder harm we're looking to prevent. That can only be done, in my opinion, in a standards manner, collective, collaborative standards development manner. But I also think that the point is like Iowa, where we all know that ag runoff is going to poison someone. As long as we've maintained our voluntary position on it, we keep making sure that we can't drink the water each spring. So I think there is a balance between number one, knowing what is the true danger and harm, knowing what the source and the why of it is, understanding what the standards are that we are needing to address it, but then arriving through a pathway of what will be a long road, especially now in the United States, towards an acceptance of a need that with these ultra hazardous technologies, regulation is mandatory. So,
Yeah, I mean, I think of regulation. I mean, at least my initial perception is regulation is more about like harm prevention. It's like a floor. Nobody can go below this floor. This is but a lot of the standards and principles, that Dan and Leah have been working on are somewhat more aspirational. Like this is what we wanted to achieve. Now, there are some harm prevention things in standards as well. Leah, what do you think about that? How does your work fit into the vision the blueprint that Dan laid out?
Yeah, I'll say something about what you just brought up. And then if I could share some slides, I was also thinking about hopefully the value of sharing a little bit of the history of the development of the standards that
That'd be
include
great. That would be
AI,
great.
and also why this case is semi-unique. But I think that across a variety of professions, the word standards and guidelines, principles, and values have been used more interchangeably than can always be helpful. That's what I would say. So formally, I think the idea of a standard is that it's something that we can hold people accountable to, whether it's through a membership organization or legally or, so to speak, morally, as opposed to a set of values or principles which are aspirational. And I'll come back to that when I go over a little bit of the history. But I think that it is used differently in different disciplines or actually even different membership organizations. So it's a really important point for us to be exploring as we think about governance. So Dan started us off by talking about how all three of these realms are needed for for what we're calling an ecosystem of governance. And Chris talked about chapters 1, 2, 3, and chapter 4 is Scott's chapter, where he has so much experience in the development of international standards, almost as a contributor to developing them, but also almost a historian around that process. That's a very interesting chapter. Again, it's focused on governance as opposed to dispute resolution. But for our participants and folks engaging today and eventually watching online, I do want to point out chapter 5 is specifically a case study about the development of standards for online dispute resolution. And what we're arguing is, while not entirely unique in the entire world, it is relatively unusual to have a combination of both international standards and professional standards together, because usually these are separate boxes. And so what I'm going to do, with your permission, is share my slides and just briefly go through a handful of things I wanted to highlight. So as I'm mentioning now, we felt that since dispute resolution serves all sectors of society and it also crosses national boundaries, that the standards that include AI now should be designed to reflect that reality. They were created by the National Center for Technology and Dispute Resolution and ICODR. So this is a chance for us to celebrate the incredible international impact that ICODR has had. And they were designed, as I said, specifically to be transdisciplinary, transprofessional, and relevant across legal jurisdictions, and not fitting into these traditional silos of what standards are usually developed for. So there have been ODR standards for several years, and I'll speak to that in a minute, but we felt an urgency to include AI in that, given the dramatic opportunities and increasing risks to access to justice. The other thing is, speaking to what Colin just mentioned about there being, in a way, a floor that standards or regulations can provide, is so often they are designed to just stop harm or reduce harm or prevent harm and liability. But we thought that if it's written in a way to actually highlight that there is a responsibility, if I can mix metaphors, if the floor that we place for dispute resolvers and ODR systems, then if we state that access to justice is crucial, then AI should be used when it will benefit and when it will not raise risks inappropriately. So we all know that access to justice is tremendously increased through AI. And in that way, the positive impact of AI really illustrates what I call productive disruption. And so that fostering AI for public good really belongs in standards. And then we all know a longer list than this, but here are some of the common risks that get discussed around the use of AI in dispute resolution and obviously in other arenas as well. I think there's not enough discussion about how, while we might name risks or name opportunities for parties, including the third human party, we don't often drill down to look at the fact that there are differentiated risks and differentiated opportunities. So this is something for those of us that are choosing off-the-shelf AI platforms or are designing or hiring people to design ODR systems for us, that we, rather than just look at the fact that it provides some opportunities to do an assessment of whether the risks or the opportunities are the same for all the participants who would be involved, including the third party. So the dispute resolution silo we have had for years, a real insufficiency in addressing technology, and that fortunately has begun to really change, but we have not had that regarding AI until recently. So the goal was to develop guardrails that would protect against unequal procedural and substantive injustice, and also to start paying overt attention to fifth parties, the software and LLM architects that otherwise are functioning, often without the dispute resolver or interveners, and certainly without the disputant's perspective, that they are really the gatekeepers of access to justice, as they determine what data is used that we might include in giving us great brainstorm ideas for interventions that might lead to compounding biases or provide wonderful opportunities for greater brainstorms. Dan spoke about the market, and I'm going to come back to that. The market forces are very important, and we are contributors to communicating what we expect, what we demand, and what we need as those of us that teach and practice in this field. But good intentions in the market have been insufficient, as we well know. That's why risks are also high regarding AI. So we needed standards around AI that would focus on the level and type of reliance on AI, and also address issues of accountability and oversight. The other thing I'll just mention here is that we purposefully designed them to be as thin as possible and still relevant, so that they could be interpreted in different legal jurisdictions and work well as much as possible with other governance mechanisms like membership organization requirements or laws or regulation. So here's the little history piece. As all of you know, Ethan Katch and Janet Rifkin really gave birth to the idea of ODR and started the National Center in 1998. And over the next decade, with discussions among colleagues, including Dan and Colin and others, regarding what the first ODR standards that were issued in 2009 should include. ICANN has used them since then for handling domain name disputes. And then as the UN, the EU, and other organizations, especially large regional and international organizations with a representative from different governmental bodies, met to begin discussing what kind of international standards should be relevant, especially around e-commerce. This is when we jumped in and said, it's taking a long time to build consensus. And so therefore, we may want to issue a set of ethical principles that are values to help guide the discussion around the development of further rules. And in 2017, ICODR was developed for two purposes. Many of you know this and your members already, and we're so happy about that. And that is to be a membership organization and also to be a standards issuing body. And so we built the ODR standards that were issued in 2017 on the ethical principles and the previous standards. And then in May 2022, we finished about 2 years of work in revising those standards and including AI explicitly. And this just happened to be 6 months before ChatGPT was released. And clearly, we are now dealing with the incredibly exciting and also, raising risks, the experimentation of using AI with dispute resolution. Many of you are already familiar with this, but I'll just note that if you're not, you can find the ODR standards at icodr.org on the standards page or on the center page at odr.info. And each one of them has 1 or 2 paragraphs that are specifically about technology. And I'm just going to show you the 3 that specifically relate to AI. So under accountable, we see here that the standard now, the floor, is that there must be human oversight over the traceability of the originality of documents and the path to outcome when AI is used, and the relative control given to humans and AI in decision making and outcomes. And under equal, that there must be proactive efforts to try to prevent AI from creating, replicating, and compounding bias. And under transparent, that all the sources and methods used to gather data that influences decisions by AI must be disclosed, and that the practitioners and the platforms make a commitment that they're living up to the legislation or regulation in their jurisdictions. And so since 2017, when we first put the first set of standards out, most recently, and then again in 2022, we've been encouraging people to self-certify. And we've got an endorsement phrase on ICODR.org under the standards if people want to consider putting it under their email name or on their website. We also encourage that those courts or those who run rosters of mediators or arbitrators, for example, will either require or encourage people to self-certify. And also that those of us that are in a position to hire people to craft ODR tools and that it will include AI, that we give them, the fifth parties, our standards to hold it up. Now here, we think about the fact that the market can make a difference. If you have this on your website and say that you live up to these standards, hopefully that will build trust for your practice. And lastly, I'll just note that we are excited to share, many of you might know this already, but after a number of years of negotiation, with ICODR helping to represent the United States, and Colin was deeply involved in that for several years with me, and the International Organization for Standardization, which has 175 countries' standards bodies as members, created the first ODR standard, ISO standard 32122, and they fully adopted the ICODR standards and cite ICODR in the center for developing them. And this has just happened just over 6 months ago. So lastly, I'll just note, not to do a sales job, but in case someone was thinking of buying this very expensive book, there's a 25% off discount that goes through December, and it's 72525. So with that, I hope that helps to highlight kind of the history of the development, but also I just want to close this piece of it by emphasizing that we hope that this is a good demonstration of the incorporation of, I guess I would say once again, following the productive disruption of the way AI works across silos by creating international standards that are also cross-sectorial and cross-discipline.
That was fantastic. Thank you, Leah. That background is incredibly helpful. I think a comment was made about this from Dan at the beginning, but things are changing so fast. I mean, I remember when we first started talking about how to deal with the encroachment of AI. I think yesterday was the 3-year anniversary since the launch of ChatGPT. I think I saw that online. Just 3 years, and all of this has happened within 3 years. Initially, I think everybody said, well, we just have to have transparency. Everybody who uses API has to have a disclosure and say, this was created with AI. And I kind of feel like that's flown out the window now because AI is so omnipresent. It's hard to say where it's not being utilized, So I feel like if we had taken a snapshot of what our approach might have been to responding to the growth of AI 2 years ago, it would have said transparency, transparency, and disclosure. Now I feel like people don't talk about that. But I feel like also we are now saying human in the loop. And I find a lot of people are saying, well, look, we can't have AI deployed without a human monitoring it and checking it and ensuring. And that's what our current standards at ICODR say too, right? But again, I just worry things are changing so fast. We're seeing so many deployments of AI that the idea of a human being able to keep up with AI and evaluate all of its output is starting to become difficult to wrap your brain around. I mean, there's a lot of talk in the court sector about having AI powered small claims courts, and it's like, okay, well, if we're deciding all these cases all day, every day, we've seen this with past dispute resolution processes. When a human has to evaluate the output of a machine, they're always going to lose in that transaction because machines can scale, 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 and just be putting out. And that's kind of what we see with all this AI slop. There's so much of it, we can't even respond. So, will we feel about human in the loop in 3 years the way that we feel now about some of the transparency stuff we were talking about 2 years ago?
So,
Well,
Colin, I'm glad you brought that up for kind of two reasons, or many reasons. But one is, I do think it's realistic for us to assume that these standards, as well as many other standards regarding AI, will need to regularly be updated. And since
Absolutely.
it's built on consensus, then it also means it's a slow, long, and an important democratic participatory process. And so there's this tension between, there's no way we're ahead of the curve, but how can we keep moving, right? So that's one thing to keep. So these discussions are urgent, they're important, and we will always be lagging. And that's why the idea of an ecosystem that includes aspirational principles, standards, regulation, and law is important. The other thing is, I was very struck by Chris's description in our book launches that we have had in the past couple of weeks, where he discusses how when we have and Chris, I should hand it to you, but when we have technology that can cause tremendous harm and disaster, we usually don't disperse it among the public while we experiment on it. And so, what is our expectation and our demands as a society and as practitioners and educators in the field to say, how far can we mess with access to justice when we already have such inequality and such high risk indifference when we're not even including AI? AI can repair some of that. It also can make some of it worse. So I think that rich discussions like the ones that we're having today are so important. But Chris, let me hand it to you because I think you say that quite articulately, given your background in hazards,
Yeah, and I
hazards
think that
regulation.
and I think one of the things that is important is to know which of these items are truly terms of art and which ones are, phrases that we sometimes use, right? So, I mean, in the chapter we go into, and I think within the ODR community is first published in the National Center and State Courts guidance on artificially augmented systems back in pre-pandemic. And when we're looking at in the loop, on the loop, and out of the loop. Those are terms of art of where the safety person is. And your equivalents of those are important to know. In the loop means your system is a fail safe. By definition, if it fails, it safes. So when we say fail safe, that means a human is in the loop. And the platforms want the tools to be, in the loop, meaning it will not run without a human approving that process because I now have a platform. And as anyone in America knows, once I have a platform and once that platform is open to anyone just use however they want and the human remains in charge, I got a lot of liability shed. So while the industry wants the system to be in the loop, which means it cannot go forward if the human is there, they shed liability. We feel better about it, but that's a term of art of what that means when truly we're using these systems. When the system outruns us, it's outrunning us because it means we're on the loop. When we're checking what it's doing, but it can just keep going till we stop it, that's when we're on the loop. And on the loop is an active safe system. I have to take an action to safe it. And we know active safe systems are dangerous because for anyone old enough to remember the Deepwater Horizons, a blowout preventer is an active safe system. The reason that people want active safe systems but call them fail safe is because in a blowout preventer, for example, if you shut down a well every single time that it got an anomalous reading, you'd have to drill through a whole lot of blowout preventers all over the place. But we still advertise them as fail-safe. The same is happening for us with AI. We're saying, well, it's looking good enough and it's keeping going long enough. And so I'm just going to let that thing run and I'll just jump in when it's ready. That's how Tesla operates, right? Tesla basically says, okay, well, this is cool. The driver can be there and we'll just call it automated. We'll call it truly autopilot, but it isn't. It's driver assist. You wouldn't just sit and watch your Mercedes, drive down the street just because it has lane checking. And Tesla's doing nothing but doing the exact same thing with better marketing, or as the federal court ruled, fluffery, right? But it's just lying. And the fact is, we need to be very, very clear when we're dealing with these systems of which terms are truly terms of art. And when we use them, we set up our ODR systems appropriately. In the loop truly means if you do not commit that that action was correct, it will not continue. And you lose all efficiency with AI when you're in the loop, which is why we never really are. Similarly, looking at safety. Safety, the industry wants to be reliability. They want us to believe that when it says my system's safe, and all they're really saying is, oh, yeah, it produces the outcome you want. Well, just getting the outcome we want is not our responsibility within dispute resolution. It's not our responsibility within human interaction. Our responsibility is to the full actual safety of the stakeholders, which is reducing the probability or magnitude of a negative outcome. It's making sure that harm does not propagate faster than we can actually stop it. And and we see this a lot around hallucinations. Hallucinations are not a system failure. They are a success of the system that conflicts with objective reality. But the system is just a probabilistic vehicle that then goes and pulls some information from a shelf. And it's always going to be, by just definition and action, have a significant portion of its outcomes conflict with objective reality. The industry wants that to be called a hallucination because we can throw it away and say, oh, that's just a reliability thing. We're going to get better. And hallucinations aren't going to exist. They will always exist. And part of our role is to understand with these specific terms of art, how dangerous is this tool in how we want to use it? Because to Leah's point, and I think a little to Colin's, your point on regulation, regulation in many cases, in most places where we have, where we have systems that don't have such reach, right? An atom bomb's an ultra hazardous technology, right? A rocket's an ultra hazardous technology. Refineries have blast radiuses that are ultra hazardous. These types of ultra hazardous tools are things that we have always tested in the desert, not in the middle of society. And when we look at ultra hazardous systems, it's not as much about leveling the playing field, but when we want innovation within those ultra hazardous industries, we need uniformity. When we're dealing with things that have the ability to outrun humans, when we have the ability for their spew speed to be so fast that we can't catch up, and when we have tools that are judging what is right because it's not wrong. And for everyone knows, being right and not wrong are very, very different. That is not how you win an argument to the dinner table. It's not how when flowers arrive and say, well, I didn't do anything, fully wrong. That doesn't mean we're right. So if we look at something that's has access to exponentially depart from truth, exponentially depart from our objective reality, we need to be very, very careful what we're naming it. In those cases, regulation is that area where we can all innovate while knowing what the risk is. But where that line should be, we argue in chapter 2, we should be adopting the same risk profile that we've used for 70 years, that has been in code for has been in code for over 30 years for similar systems. And we can use that if we accept the fact this is ultra hazardous. The way we protect it with human-based protection needs to be clear on how we're actually identifying it. And the dangers must be holistic and thoughtful to the whole system, not just on an isolated piece parts, because that's where we run into being unable to apply standards exactly where they should be, which is on arguments of how addictive is addictive? When am I stealing the essence of a person? When is this, when is this conversation actually appropriate for the jurisdiction I'm in? All of those things come from us accepting the fact that I don't have a traditional product. I have an amplifier and accelerator of human actions, which can be very powerful for us. But that power, if misdirected, ends up in being an ultra hazardous outcome for our stakeholders.
Well,
Fascinating.
there are times when I feel almost too pedestrian to be involved in the conversations with my colleagues. But for me, one of the issues that sort of troubles me and has caused me to think about this in the first place is if I'm some poor mediator or arbitrator or a lawyer sitting around trying to figure out what the hell I should be asking about these systems, what I should be worried about. That to me is a very large issue. The last thing that you'll find in the book is a series of questions that we've suggested could be asked by users of the systems they may use and could be asked of the people who are producing those systems. I mean, there are, by one count, there are at least 50 different modes of mediation around the world, and there's lots of difference, but there's a lot of overlap as well. And the likelihood that the things that we would ask about systems in terms of their behavior will change quickly is very great. You know, just it would be kind of interesting to think about the notion of whether or not an AI system can develop a psychopathology. Hallucination is a term that we use that is human-based. You know, you could think about obsession and delusion and all sorts of other things. But if you pull it back to the user, to the person who's a practitioner, am I going to stop asking, when is it safe for my parties to talk to one another? Am I going to stop asking, how are we handling the information that could damage them? Am I going to stop asking, how do I create this environment that doesn't create a power imbalance among the parties? Am I going to stop asking those questions? I'm probably not going to stop asking those questions. What I want to know is, how is this thing that I'm thinking about using going to affect those basic things that are fundamental to my practice that are not going to change? And so to me, this whole notion of regulation, standards, et cetera, the driving force behind all of it is, what do I do as a person who's going to use this stuff, and how do I do it in a way that doesn't mess up my profession?
And that's actually, if I could interject there, that is what we hope that the graphic that Chris helped make, that I showed earlier, can be so helpful. So when we think about those questions, and technology really magnifies both access and also risk, but not equally. So if we attach a lens of thinking about risk and opportunity as being differential, then, and not just between the parties, but also for the mediator, I think that will help. There's a set of great questions. Dan took really lead in that, and so hopefully that will be useful. And also the questions you already ask yourself behind your practice, or if you're a trainer and training others, the questions that you ask people to consider are extremely relevant. And we would just say, add AI into the mix using that differential lens.
Yeah, I will say I want to open it up for everybody else to ask questions, because this is such a fascinating conversation and so essential to the future of the ODR field. I will say, having been through, I have enough gray hair to remember a couple other hype cycles we've been through, even the creation of the internet and creation of e-commerce, the creation of social networking. And these technologies spread on the perceived benefits. And then the harms emerge. And then we go, oh, wow, boy, these are negative things. And I find with AI, we are in the middle of the hype cycle. And I think we, as deep thinkers who think about the use of technology and the work that we do, I think it's a little bit like when people take medicine. Like, I can't evaluate the safety of this medicine, but I trust that somebody else is. I trust that somebody is spending a lot of time thinking about this, who's created a rubric and gone through and done that, and then I feel comfortable taking the medicine. If I'm a mediator and I'm just resolving family disputes in, Des Moines, I don't have time to go and evaluate all this stuff. I don't have time to look at the data sets that inform the AI tools that I use. I'm going to look to somebody that I trust, and then I'm going to say, hey, you've looked at this, you've thought about this. Is this okay for me to use? And they say, yes, it is. And then I'm going to deploy it. And I think that we on this call is a pretty good cross section of the kind of experts. People in the field look to us to say, hey, tell me what's safe and what's not. And I think you're right. It is a moving target for sure. That's why we need to have these conversations. But, at Mediate.com, I have lots of mediators that come to me every day. Should I be using AI? What tools should I use? And, Dan called out some of the things, the key questions you have to ask yourself, but a lot of them are beyond the purview of an average practitioner. And they're going to look to experts like us to say, hey, we vetted these things, and these are the things that are safe to use, because they don't want to get into the nuts and bolts about thinking about what guardrails exist and don't exist. And I do think that, as Chris said, a lot of harms are going to emerge, and we're going to have to figure out how to ameliorate them down the road. But we haven't spent a lot of time. I mean, that's not constraining the growth of AI. It's growing on the basis of this is going to be great. It's going to change the world. It's going to make everybody billions of dollars. It's going to increase access to justice. We all very clearly can see some of the risks, but I feel like those are being de-emphasized in terms of the pursuit of the benefits.
I think
To
there
me,
is
there's
one.
yeah. I was just going to
Like,
say, to me, there's this gap still between the fifth party and the third party using AI. And so because I spend so much time with in teaching and training, that's most of where I'm spending my energy besides the ODR ethics work and engaging with my wonderful colleagues here. And that is to say, I think there are going to be new professions and people who are already in the dispute resolution field who have the skill set to be the translator between the practitioner and to do an analysis or audit. I think that there's going to be a growing market, and I think it will be a great contribution to the field. But I encourage law schools and dispute resolution programs to be thinking about adding courses that are related to that, maybe partnering with computer science, for example.
and I
Chris, you
guess I
want to
would,
say something?
yeah, the one thing I would say is sort of a note of darkness a little bit though, is that I think that there isn't enough thought about this. I think that the one that infuriated me and wanted me to check the phone was Kara Swisher interviewing the then CEO of OpenAI during that whole uprising for 48 hours, and the answers were vapid and thoughtless. And I think that from our side, our responsibility is another cross promotion. A lot of you have been involved in this book here, which is the ODR theory and practice. And in here, we have in there a lot of good principles. The question is, how do we view AI within, as I argue in chapter 7, when we're building our ODR systems and tools already, where does it fit in there, right? There are appropriate uses for it that allow us to have commercial off-the-shelf AI be used tomorrow very effectively, as long as we are not implementing in locations that are going to be precipitating the concept that procedural justice always arrives at justice. Our whole industry is predicated on the fact that procedural justice doesn't always get it done, and amplify and accelerating it will amplify and accelerate injustice. AI is a mimic, and we just need to be very clear on what we want to mimic in our processes.
Absolutely. Let me open it up. We've got a lot of smart people on this call. What are your thoughts, reactions, questions about the book, for sure, but also about the broader topic in terms of,
I think I cut off Jim twice already. Sorry.
I I have a question. My experience is AI is everywhere. We go to write an email these days, and AI says, "Let me do it for you." We go to do what we thought was a Google search, and suddenly we're getting AI back as responses, etc. And it's also in terms of getting clients and scheduling clients and doing your finances, as well as things like drafting and DocuSign and etc. So I'm wondering if the panel would make a differentiation between what I might call administrative or ministerial functions, to run the office, get the modern job done, versus substantive AI involvement. So, for example, and the issue for me is transparency. What do we have an obligation to reveal, either as a program or an individual mediator, to our participants? And it seems to me if I'm going out and doing my own research, if I'm encouraging them to do certain prompts on certain platforms, for me, that should all be fully transparent. And I believe it's consistent with our field. But there's a lot of administrative functions that are now being performed by AI robots, whether it's responding to inquiries or whether it's Grammarly on the back end, where I really don't know that transparency is helpful to the party. So do you make a differentiation in terms of the recommended transparency of a mediator or program between administrative functions as opposed to substantive consideration of the issues that are in dispute.
Can I jump at this real quick because this is a great hype cross-selling of the book as well. In chapter 2, we do go into this. The quick answer is no. I don't believe there's a differentiation between them. What the differentiation is what is the potential negative harm, and is the chance of something going wrong relative to the size of that negative harm still operating in that realm of ethical, right? So when I'm thinking about things that can go wrong, keep in mind, email data breaches with email is your most likely source of data breach. If we're looking at something where the type of information, if it's a scheduling item, right? Scheduling item, is that going to happen relatively frequently? Sure, it's going to happen relatively frequently. But what's the actual downside risk of it? This is within the book. We present the catastrophic value curve as a way to look at these things. And this is Angie Raymond and I published this first in this format back in 2019 on when is a technology ethical to use. Pulling back, pulling down from other ultra-resistless technologies now, same process for over 70 years, same risk thresholds for the last 30 years of what's acceptable. What we would argue is if you're in that green region where, for example, our 10% rule, if this could go wrong up to 1 in 10 times, it takes you less than an hour to fix it, i.e. there's no harm for less than an hour of your work, cool, that's ethical. That's a failure rate that makes some sense, right? If you're using the tool for something that if it could go wrong 1 in 10 times, like for example, you're allowing it to have a chat with a bot on itself, and you're having it ask about factors of law that could lead that per se litigant to go, or per se individual to go take actions or do things that could take a lawyer at least half a week to finish. Really shouldn't do that at all. Right? So I think it's not an issue of are these tools fundamentally different in a different use? It's is the manner in which you're using the exact same tool providing access to a threat or a negative outcome of a certain size relative to how often it's going to fail. And so that approach of thinking about all these tools are ultra hazardous, we need to be narrow in their use, well defined in its reach to actually choose how we want to perform. As a mediator, you should probably not have a root level install of Claude on your work computer. There's just way too many dumb ways that can actually go off and start gathering all kinds of data, compiling it and misusing in ways you don't know. That's just a really unethical way to look at that tool, right? But is there a problem with you managing and typing into Claude you're typing into Claude some ideas for mediation resolutions that you then, being in the loop, are able to now filter and use on? Sweet, use that all day. No big deal. That's an in the loop example of the exact same tool used in a different controlled manner. So we don't differentiate between any system that can learn and any system that can actually, ingest information, turn it into its own data set for its repurposing in something else, are all going to be the same. It's their use case in your system design that's important.
Well, I come at this from a slightly different direction, but get to more or less the same place. If if you think about the use of AI in back office, on the front end or the back end, scheduling, getting contact information, etc. Do I disclose that? Yeah. Do I tell my clients the name of my assistant who does that for me? No, I probably don't. It's irrelevant. But I don't stop thinking about the fact that the way I gather that information, as Chris was just talking about, may in fact violate some confidentiality. I have to think about that. But is that something that I'm going to make a big deal of with my clients? Probably not if I've chosen well. The issue for me is the AI that I'm using affecting the way I interact with the people who are at the table with me? Basically, if I go off and do as Chris said, if I type into Claude, give me some ideas about how to resolve this, and I treat that the same way I would treat it if I called you up, Jim, and said, Jim, give me some ideas, I'm stuck. I wouldn't go back to my clients and say, hey, Jim Malaman says I ought to do so and so. It'd be very helpful, but I might ask questions that would make them talk about things they weren't talking about. I might do a lot of different things, but I wouldn't necessarily go back and say, hey, I went off and talked to Jim. I feel the same way about AI. So the question is it, for me, is it going to affect the way I interact with my parties? Is it going to change the dynamic of the communication that I'm trying to manage? And if it is, that's a big deal. And I probably ought to disclose that.
So thank you very much for that, Ann, because I think just at a practical, where the rubber meets the road level, mediators understanding what they really should be disclosing, us coming up with model checklists, things like that for them to at least review. Another kind of fundamental question, mediation versus arbitration. In mediation, let's presume it's voluntary at all points in time. Let's presume that the parties have decision-making control, complete decision-making control at every moment in time. Let's presume that it's confidential. Nothing will be held against them one way or another. And I'm wondering, in this context, where the parties have much more agency, complete control until they agree or don't agree, do you see that the disclosure standards, the transparency standards are different between mediation and arbitration, or do you think they're the same?
I think, well, I defer to my colleagues, but I think they're different because if I'm the arbitrator writing up a decision and writing up a document that is going to be binding on the people who came to see me, and I am using an AI program to give me information about that. We all know some of the problems that can cause. We all know some of the dynamics that can cause, and I think I should disclose that. I think it's quite different from seeking advice in a mediation where that advice isn't going to come back and be directly put upon the people that I'm working with. So I do, in fact, myself see a difference in transparency between
So
arbitration and mediation.
I was going to say, for me, this raises the question of the relationship between the standards. So transparency is key, and you're asking some really important questions, Jim, for us to grapple with. And it can sometimes be in tension with some of the other issues, like accessibility. Well, what if it costs a lot of money? And so one of our parties has access to powerful tools and the other one doesn't. What do we do? What's neutral? Intervening, not intervening? These questions. And so accessibility and transparency or neutrality, they're interlocked. And so I don't think, and I know you're not asking for that, I don't think there's one answer, but what we are recommending regarding the ODR standards that include AI is that we see them as interlocking and then struggle with the tensions when there are tensions. And the other thing I would say is it seems to me that anything that has an impact on people's ability to participate as fully as possible, and therefore on the potential for good quality substantive justice, ought to be included in what's made transparent. And so that may look different in mediation than arbitration on some components and not on others.
I guess as long as we're voting, I guess my position is I think my outcome is different to Dan's with respect to whether or not the disclosures are the same, but because of Leah's answer, I think the issue is how impactful is the actual use of the tool. It isn't the fact that the tools used there necessarily should change the disclosures. Right? I agree aggressively with Leah that in an arbitration there's more likelihood if the way we're using AI typically is in more of an influential and impactful manner. The negative outcome of getting it wrong in arbitration and the way it's typically being used now makes it a disclosable item or something that we should definitely be disclosing. I mean, we've even seen a lawsuit where they overturned the arbitration as a result of using too much AI. So we should be disclosing it if we're using it to make decisions versus a facilitation piece. So if you're using the same manner, I think the disclosure should be the same.
I think that this is a really fundamental issue we need to grapple with, where the end product of an arbitration is a decision. So everything goes into the decision. It's hard to say anything would not, to be honest with you. In mediation, as a practical level, I find AI wonderful as an idea generator, including what has worked for similarly situated others. And the one practical rule I encourage mediators is never inquire in the singular, always inquire in the plural. What are the possibilities? What are solutions that have worked for others? What are options? What are exchanges? Always in the plural. And I think that's a little bit of a safety valve. So I don't know what the answers are here, but there are real qualitative differences between the arbitration process going for a decision and the mediation process. I'm concerned that we might trip ourselves up a little bit, because I view the informed use of AI as the most empowering aspect for participants that I've ever come across. The average participant in mediation can't afford an expensive lawyer. And so it's like, can they get valuable AI information, even if not perfect, versus nothing, And what's a mediator's role in that empowering relationship? So I see there's a real opportunity as we take online mediation to scale, that mediators could be a helpful agent, really elevating the information base and the empowerment of decision-making folks,
Yeah.
dealing with ordinary disputes. So I'm just hoping we won't put too many impediments in the way, at least of mediators constructively using it as an idea generator, and us all joining together to really think through what are all the possibilities, what might work best.
Well, we could have this conversation for the next 2 hours, and I'm sure we wouldn't run out of topics. But I am in charge of the time here, and I do know we're 3 minutes over our allotted time. I will say, Jim, if we're going to empower any group of decision makers to steer us through this, I can nominate no better triumvirate than the three authors on this book. So you guys have thought about this in such a powerful and deep way, and you're raising these important questions. And I think, again, we can answer them all one way now, and in 6 months, things will change enough. We've got to reconvene again and consider them as well. But I just want to thank very much Dan, Chris, Leah, not only for joining us here today, but for also all the work you've put into this book. And I think we need to have lots and lots and lots of more meetings to chew through this, because we just barely skimmed the surface today. But can everybody join me in giving a round of applause and thanks to our authors for joining us?
Yes, thank you for being with us. We really appreciate it.